The metals sang before daylight. In a windowless hall deep beneath the ridge, presses breathed steam and furnaces threw orange tongues against ceiling beams. Sparks fell like a private rain. Frederick Brackett crouched at the test bench, palms dark with grease, and listened as if the steel might speak in clear phrases. Something in the long underwater profile of the machine, the rhythm of its pistons, the harmonics of its crank, had been wrong for weeks. Now, in the hush between adjustments, an almost human cadence rose from the crankcase. A low, throbbing pulse that either meant they had finally coaxed the engines into order or that the whole assembly was about to come apart. Brackett had grown used to translating metal into voice. He had learned, while chasing failures in other forges, that alloys kept secrets in their grain, that a bearing had a particular way of announcing fatigue. Tonight, the secret was acoustic. A whine at mid-range, a rasp under low load that carried through the test cell and out into the subterranean corridors where men and women bent over lathes and drill presses. He tightened a gauge, felt the instrument tremble in his fingers, and mouthed a single, private syllable of relief when the sound shifted. Not solved, not yet, but less urgent. For all the focused calm he cultivated, Brackett did not pretend ignorance of what was beyond those walls. He knew the machine before him had a life at sea, in a metal skin that made small men into long shadows on the oceans. He knew, too, that this factory had been pushed into secrecy as the war tightened and naval doctrine demanded a quieter, more survivable U-boat. The plant, tucked into a valley and served by guarded rail spurs, had been built to make diesel engines and their acoustic trimmings, damped mounts, precision bearings, muffled intakes, and housings machined with an almost obsessive care. Each feature was a small plea for silence. A thin woman with grease-smudged braids, one of the many who had taken the line when men had marched away, came and stood at his shoulder. She did not need to speak. A glance along the row of instruments, at the sheet metal muffler they had just fitted, told her everything. Brackett straightened, wiped his hands on his trousers, and allowed himself a look at the engine as if it were a living thing, broad-shouldered, flanged, weathered from testing but not defeated. He heard, faintly, a memory of a heartbeat motif he had once used in a lecture to make a point about endurance. Here it felt literal. He had arrived 3 weeks earlier, not as an invader, but as an engineer on a mission, designated vague enough to keep its aim secret even from most of the men who operated the presses. Allied forces had pushed across Germany unevenly, front lines moved in jagged arcs. The plant had been sealed, then reopened to a small contingent of specialists tasked with cataloging equipment and understanding what the enemy had built. Brackett's orders were simple and terrible in equal measure. Determine what made these engines quieter and report whether those methods could be turned to Allied advantage. He had not expected to find a family of craftsmen beneath the plant's concrete ribs. Men who had come of age tuning rural tractors, women who had learned to feed steel on wartime quotas, a handful of engineers who still kept diagrams in neat leather cases. Their voices were low. Many were wary of strangers with clipped English or with uniforms that still smelled faintly of oil. Samuel Ortiz, a young mechanic from a port battalion who had been assigned as Brackett's assistant because he could read and because his hands were deft, moved among them with easy courtesy, translating jokes and shorthand and the short, guarded histories each worker allowed themselves. Ortiz had been aboard convoy duty in the Atlantic before transfer to engineering tasks in the European theater. He carried a photograph of a brother whose ship had gone down in the winter before. It was folded until its creases softened. He did not talk about the sinking often, but when he did, his jaw set and the work took on a sharper edge for him. He wanted answers that were practical. What exactly damped that whine? How many hours could these engines run at reduced acoustic output? He asked in the blunt, impatient way youth often masks as competence.
The plant had been pushed into secrecy because the Kriegsmarine had been experimenting with every plausible route to stealth. War at sea had evolved in the years before the conflict into a duel of detection and evasion. Hull streamlining, snorkel systems to allow diesel operation below wave tops, batteries for silent running, and, crucial to long-range effectiveness, engines that radiated less vibration into the ocean. The term silent in common speech was an overstatement. Engineers used it more carefully. They spoke of reductions in radiated noise, in tonal peaks that sonar trawl would pick up, in a hull's tendency to sing. Each decibel shaved from a signature increased the margin of survival. The plant's role was to push that margin outward. Technical solutions had arrived in small increments. One workshop made damper housings with laminated rubber layers sandwiched between steel plates to isolate the bench from the hull. Another group honed the precision of crank journals until the balance was almost an art. The better the balance, the less the harmonic that punched through water like a staccato call. Intelligence briefings, dry, bureaucratic things, spoke in numbers about effective radiated power and frequency windows. In the test cell, these were human problems. A machinist whose fingers had learned to feel an out-of-round shaft as a stutter at the wrist. An assembler who could sense a misaligned mount by the way a wrench left a mark. Brackett moved between those worlds.
He had been a metallurgist before, a man who learned to read etchings and grain flows like a priest read scripture. He could tell when an alloy had been quenched too fast by the way it fractured under a file. He could look at a bearing and know whether a batch of steel had been allowed to cold work improperly. That night, as the engine's song shifted under his hands, he thought of the sequence of small betrayals that had led them here. War's demand for output, shortages in nickel and chromium that forced substitutions in alloy recipes, the hurried expansion of crews that diluted craft standards. Each act had introduced its own way for the engine to complain. The plant's engineers kept logs in a careful, almost conspiratorial script. Brackett spent hours with those pages. There were entries that read like confessions. Vibration rose at 1500 RPM after 30 minutes, or counterweight sheared, observed at frame 3. Between the clinical notes, some entries carried a human residue. A sketch of a machinist's hand, the date wrote with a flourish, an ink blot of uncertain origin. A single note, appended in a different hand and clipped to the back of a sheet, struck him like evidence of private grief. For my boy, to have when I am gone. The note did not say whether the boy had gone to sea or to the front. It didn't have to. In a place where survival depended on silence, these pages were a small, loud testament to the people who kept the machines alive. They tested in cycles that felt like prayers. Assemble, run, measure, strip, change, repeat. On one morning when the fog still clung to the valley and the plant's exhaust stacks breathed like sleeping beasts, Brackett watched a complete run. He and Ortiz and a small circle of technicians had altered the intake geometry and replaced a set of flexible couplings with a design that Harold Wentworth, a draftsman whose proposals had been dismissed twice, insisted would change the harmonic. Wentworth had the quiet, stubborn look of a man used to being told he was wasting time until a drawing was forced to vindicate him. When the technician cranked the starter and the diesel rolled through its warm-up, the entire cell held breath. The engine spun up in a sequence Brackett had catalogued in his head years ago. An oily, heavy pull at first, then a smoothing as fuel pressure met injector timing, then the mid-range harmonics that had tormented them. For a tense minute, the rasp lived. Then it softened. The coupling gave differently. Some frequencies were gone, replaced by a new low hum that moved under the skin like an answered question. Brackett checked the vibration spectra and felt an odd, clean satisfaction.
This was not victory. The machine had only ceased complaining at a particular load. The larger tests, endurance at sea, behavior under fluctuating loads, the way sound coupled into the hull and radiated into water, remained. Yet, the small success mattered.
It had been bought with nights without tearful letters home, with a foreman named Kine who had scarred palms from hand-sanding manifold flanges, and with women who ran drills when men were no longer available. It had been paid for in coffee and in the silence that fell over a test cell where people uncoiled themselves and spoke in whispers. Ortiz, who had spent the earlier months as conduit and translator, allowed himself a grin, then turned his head to hide it. Brackett thought of the photograph in Ortiz's jacket and could guess why a small technical victory felt like a personal thing for him. Outside the plant, corridors of the conflict unfurled with their own rhythms, supply lines strained. Admirals and their staff, far from the rising heat of the test cells, issued demands and clipped memos. Quieter engines, faster deliveries, compatibility with existing hull designs. The word urgency had become a bureaucrat's blunt instrument. Brackett found that the story of the engine could not be told without those voices. Each piece of drawing, every shift change on the line, pressed against a timeline drawn by war planners who wanted to change the calculus of detection. In strategic terms, quiet meant reach. A U-boat that could inhale air through a snorkel and run its diesel at a lower signature while charging batteries extended its submerged endurance and muffled its presence on sonar. Small reductions in noise could mean that a convoy escort would classify a passing signature as benign, not worth expending a depth charge pattern. The factory's output did not dictate strategy alone. Sonar arrays, aerial patrols, and code breaking also moved pieces on the chessboard. Historians would later debate the extent to which any single technical advance shifted the war at sea. Brackett's job was narrower and more visceral, to make the engine sing less loudly so that men in metal shells might have a few more hours between detection and destruction. Even while the test cells celebrated a local triumph, the men who designed and assembled the components felt the pressure to scale. The plant was no single-issue workshop. It had to turn prototypes into thousands of units. Where a laboratory could afford handcrafted quality, production demanded speed. Forging dies were redesigned for higher throughput. Jigs were modified to reduce error margins. X-ray inspection stations multiplied, looking inside castings for internal voids that would later become sources of vibration. The supervisors argued in clipped German about tolerances and rejects. Brackett, more accustomed to meticulous adjustments than to mass management, felt a different tiredness settling into him. The fatigue of knowing that a perfection achieved on a bench could be broken by the economies of mass. Scaling brought human consequences. A worker named Helga, who had run the cold press lines before the war, lost 2 fingers in a mishap that was never made public. She returned with a padded glove and a quiet determination to keep her wage. Cain, who had once bragged he had no fear of metal, took to holding his breath during tests and smoking clove cigarettes in the evenings. The plant's infirmary grew busy with small injuries, splinters, burns, strains, the kind that accumulation made into a communal weight. There were also tensions along class and gender lines. Older journeymen who resented the speed-up, women whose hands had become as skilled as any man's and who wanted recognition beyond a few canned praises on paydays. Brackett kept a private ledger alongside the plant's formal logs. He wrote, in brief English, notes about metallurgy, but also phrases about the workers. Helga, steady hand, lost digits, but not patience. Cain, bandaged, won't say why he bent the flange. He caught himself anthropomorphizing machines, as the long nights and the need for narrative do to those who live inside mechanical ecosystems. The engines were not merely parts. They were potential carriers of lives, vectors of policy. The secrecy of the plant made personal relations both intense and fragile. Many had nowhere else to send letters. Censorship and travel restrictions meant that news was a thin thread. Ortiz, whose brother had not returned from the Atlantic, took to writing long, rambling notes to a name he did not dare utter aloud. Brackett, who had his own family back across an ocean and who kept letters folded in a locker, understood the ache. Sometimes at 3 in the morning, he would step outside into the valley's damp air and try to imagine the sea, the one place where these engines, in their muffled dignity, would ultimately be tested. The engineers, for all their technical acumen, were not blind to the moral landscape. There were moments when a blueprint was more than a document. It was a ledger of intent. Brackett had a conversation one night with a senior designer, a man whose accent carried the old cadences of a teacher. They stood in the shadow of a cooling manifold and discussed the possible futures of a quieter engine. The designer spoke of craft and of the moral emptiness of machines divorced from human consequence. "We make things," he said in German, and Brackett felt the translation as a moral question as much as a factual one. "We do not decide who they will serve." Brackett's answer was softer than he would later admit. He said that engineers made knowledge, and that sometimes knowledge moved faster than wisdom. The designer nodded, but kept his eyes on the manifold as if he could see the ghost of ships passing in its flanges. The laboratory's incremental successes eventually led to the kind of test that could not be contained in a single night. A full-mount endurance run was scheduled. 48 hours at varying loads, with acoustic pickups placed at intervals along the mounting frame and measurement transducers that translated vibrations into waves on a screen. The aim was to see how the engine behaved when stressed in a way that approximated real missions, long charging cycles interrupted by bouts of power, the sort of load that might accompany a snorkel surge at night. On the day of the run, the plant smelled of oil and bread. A canteen truck serving hot stew had come earlier, and people carried bowls and ate next to blue presses as if the world had rearranged itself to allow small comforts near machines that might not forgive mistakes. Brackett adjusted dials and checked feeds, while Ortiz threaded cable through a conduit, Young with hands that moved like practiced spellers dealing in bolts. The test began at a measured pitch, and for the first hours the harmonics behaved. Then, as the engine moved into a regime intended to simulate a heavy charge cycle, a resonance began to appear at a frequency the pickups marked nervously. The run had the quality of a trial. The team made changes in staged fashion. They swapped couplings, adjusted fuel timing, reworked intake baffles. Each modification yielded better data. They were not only chasing an absolute silence, but learning how combinations of small gains stacked. In the afternoon, after a particularly clever change to the mount geometry suggested by Wentworth, the resonance collapsed into a smoother band. The room exhaled. Men who had stood watch at benches for months with worried eyes let their shoulders fall. Brackett felt the familiar thrill of a problem yielding to patient collective craft. It was at that low, exultant juncture, when the engine's song had changed in a way that suggested extended viability, that an editor's instinct whispered the need for human response. The plant's story was not merely about gear teeth and combustion. It was about the people who had apparently made the impossible practical. Ortiz, who had kept his photograph folded against his chest, allowed himself to speak to a small circle. "If Brackett's stubbornness and the work down here moved you," he said, careful and tentative, "tell us in the comments, wherever you are listening. These men and women deserve to be remembered." It was the only direct prompt that day, a human, quiet invitation that fit the tone and kept the narrative's integrity intact. It was not a call to celebration of destruction. It was a plea that this labor not vanish into anonymous archives. The prompt landed like a soft bell across the gathered faces, and then melted into the continuing attention to gauges and microphones. Brackett, who had not expected his work to be observed remotely, felt oddly exposed and oddly comforted. There were further hurdles. Night work, combined with wartime shortages, meant that batches of sleeve bearings arrived with slightly different microstructures. Some batches required rework that added days to production targets. A rapid press change resulted in an undersized flange on one manifold run. Kane discovered it before assembly and cursed heavily in the corner while regrinding. The logistics of scaling, moving billets from furnaces to lathes, ensuring seamless communication between drawing rooms and assembly bays, became as crucial as the metallurgy itself. Orders came from naval commands that were blunt and functional. There were quotes about operational necessity and diagrams calling for compatibility with multiple hull sizes. These directives squeezed the factory the way a vice might squeeze a vice, requiring tolerance without slack. Brackett, who wrote in a ledger that mixed numbers with half-phrases about the people around him, began to understand that the real test of the machine was not in a cell, but in the sea's indifferent environment, a place of salt, cold, pressure waves, and sonar pings. When the first crate left the plant, a wooden case built by slow hands for a unit of muffled parts, there was a quiet that felt like acknowledgement. The crate was labeled in stenciled letters and loaded onto a rail car bound for a coastal yard. Brackett stood on the loading platform and watched as the train eased away, pulling the crate into a fog of winter and logistics. It felt, in a private way, like a parent watching a child leave for uncertain fate. He thought, as the rails carried the crate toward the ocean, of the men who would rely on the engine and of the men who had built it. Both had been pressed into situations neither had chosen in full. Beyond the tests and the rails lay the larger theater of consequence. Quiet engines would be placed in hulls, upped the ability of submarines to travel submerged for longer intervals, and extended the moments in which a vessel could be hidden from the ears and eyes of a hunter. They were not magic. Sonar arrays, air patrols, depth charges, and code breaking were the other instruments in the contest. Historians and strategists would, in time, dispute the degree to which any single technical advance shifted outcomes. Brackett felt only a private certainty. Engineering achieved things that had moral valence, and those uses were not always within the control of the makers. For now, in the plant's rooms that smelled of hot oil and cigarette smoke, the work continued. Brackett and Ortiz and the team prepared for an overseas test, a sea trial on a submarine hull in a harbor that had been repurposed for trials. They readied documentation, tightened tolerances, and made lists of contingencies. The midnight sessions lengthened into mornings. The sun found its way through industrial skylights, and the rhythm of the place tuned itself to the engine's needs. Each small victory carried the weight of the larger war. A muffled intake here might be a quieter night for a man on the sea. It might also extend the reach of a weapon. Brackett felt the strain of that ambivalence in a way that made him restless. In evenings, when the plant's lamps dimmed and only a skeleton crew remained, he walked the length of the hall and ran his fingers along flanges that had been ground to smoothness. He imagined, not with triumph, but with reluctant respect, how those metals would talk to the ocean. In the quiet hours, he wrote letters home that he did not always send. His sentences honest about craft and careful about politics. He kept the ledger of straps and tolerances. He kept the photograph of a son he had last seen at a window. In the end, the human stories and the technical stories were braided together with an uncomfortably close twist. They sent the first fitted engines to sea. The sea trials were not spectacular in the way cinema might demand. They were a sequence of measurements and observations. Acoustic pings, vibration logs, crew reports about noticeable differences in engine feel. Brackett read those reports with the same curiosity he had once reserved for etchings. The engines performed as their tests had suggested. A measurable reduction in certain bands, a subdued radiated profile under charge. But on the last day of trials, a storm crept in, and the trial had to be curtailed. Real seas, Brackett noted, made a mockery of laboratory calm.
Back at the plant, they marked the gains and prepared for production scaling. The government's procurement channels called for increased runs. The plant's foremen argued about raw material allotments. Workers who had once been able to drink a beer in the mess after a shift now found themselves doing double work to meet quotas. Helga stitched her glove with a steady hand and did not complain. Ortiz wrote a note home and folded it 3 times before placing it in his locker. As the engines reached operational units, reports from crews came filtered and spare. Some mentioned how the motors felt more forgiving. Some noted that acoustic pickups aboard escort ships had fainter traces. None of these reports framed a single engine as decisive. The war at sea was many instruments and many mistakes. The plant's contributions were part of a broader, brutal ensemble. Still, the plant had become, in the way places can become, a crucible. It had transformed raw metals into quieter machines, trained hands that had not been trained before, and forced moral reckonings into the margins of its ledger. Brackett, who had come to find answers and to learn, had taken home a different kind of data: the knowledge that craft could be wielded toward protection and harm. He had learned the cadence of an engine's complaint and how to quiet it. He had also learned to look at blueprints and ask, quietly, who they would serve when bolted into a hull and pushed into the sea.
The valley sighed through seasons. The plant's footprint remained, its rails still bearing loads, even as the tide of war moved its arcs. Brackett and Ortiz adjusted to a schedule that had turned from constant crisis to the steady march of production. Around them, the world beyond the plant's concrete ribs continued to demand answers, for safety, for victory, or for something no one at the workbench could quite define. They had not yet seen the full consequence of the engines beyond the harbor. Reports of missions, of range, and of quiet periscopes filtered in with the slowness of wartime paper. The moral burden did not ease. It collected like soot on the underside of a brace. The work had a dignity, a craft that Brackett revered. It also had an aftermath he could not deny. The engines would find their way into halls and into histories, and both acknowledgments of ingenuity and of cost would have to be made. Night crept again over the plant. In the test room, a single engine wound down after a final run, the last vibrations tapering like a heartbeat slowing at the edge of sleep. Brackett stood by the bench, hands in his pockets, and listened as silence settled into the metal like a thought. He thought of the men at sea who might sleep a little longer because of that small reduction in noise. And he thought of the anonymous victims for whom silence held no mercy. He thought, too, of the women and men in the plant whose fingers carried the memory of this work for the rest of their lives. There would be more tests, more design tweaks, decisions about production quotas and allocations. There would also be a point when the world shifted under the weight of new paradigms, aircraft, sonar, and eventually jet power, where these engines would be repurposed or relegated to museums. For now, in the factory's quiet between runs, Brackett allowed himself the small satisfaction of a problem partially solved, and the heavy curiosity of what that solution might mean. Outside, rails carried crates into fog. Inside, the plant's lamps hummed. Men and women folded their hands and went home to rooms they had not painted. Ortiz pocketed the photograph of his brother and watched the last light fall from the press hall. He did not yet know whether the engines would save anyone he loved, but in the way a young man clings to control where he can, he kept working to make them steadier, quieter, less prone to failure. Brackett, whose life had been built on the patient practice of listening to metal, understood the shape of his work differently now, as a ledger of consequences that would be read long after the furnaces cooled. The plant readied for the next sequence of trials, and the men and women inside prepared in the only way they knew: by coming at dawn, by measuring, by sanding, by testing, by writing small, careful entries into their logbooks. The machines would sing again.
The valley would echo with their voices.
The ledger of a secret factory would grow thicker, not only with technical notes, but with the human details that made each bolt a story and each flange a moral decision. The silence they chased was an instrument for survival and a tool for harm. It would be measured, debated, and, in time, remembered. The letter came on a wet morning, the sky a low sheet of gray that made the valley look like a thing turned inward. Ortiz had been late to the line, his sleeves still dusty from the previous night's work. He opened it with fingers that trembled, as if the paper were already an accusation. The envelope bore the Navy's neat type and a stamp whose ink had bled in the damp. He read it once, then again, the words folding into themselves like metal under heat. His brother's Versal had been reported overdue. A routine patrol, the letter said, had failed to return. Search efforts were ongoing. Language that, in other hands, would have been clinical, presumed lost, slammed into Ortiz like a hammer. He stared at the photograph in his pocket, a weathered face grinning beside a length of rope, sunlight on the cheekbones. He had kept it because the man it pictured had stood between him and a loneliness that made nights long and small. Brackett found him at the lathe, not at his bench, and did not ask first. He had learned the language of look and pause in that room well enough to know when something had snapped. He set his own tools down with a slow care and watched Ortiz fold the letter into itself, then open it to read once more, as if the act of reading could negotiate a different answer. "Is it," Brackett began, "because what else was there to begin with?" He stopped. The clatter of the shop wore on. Machines exhaled steam and heat. Someone called for an adjustment to a jig half a bay away. The world kept functioning in its ordinary, indifferent way. Ortiz shook his head, then let out a long breath that might have been a laugh if anything about the moment had allowed joy. "They're looking," he said. "They're looking. But you know what they say." Brackett's hand went to the photograph in Ortiz's pocket, and, with the tacit permission of friendship, drew it out. The face looked up at him like a promise that stubbornly refused to be kept. At the end of the day, rather than go home to rooms they had not painted, they walked toward the harbor. The plant's concrete skeleton receded behind them. Rails cut the low plain like seams. The harbor was a flat of gray water and lines of hulks. A submarine lay at the pier, bulk low and unadorned, sailors moving with a slow efficiency as if grief had taught them to economize motion. Brackett watched as men performed tasks that no manual could soften: folding clothes, stacking dishes, emptying lockers. He understood, with a particular clarity that sharpened the edges of his own conscience, that these things were not mechanistic. Each bolt and lever that he had touched might have an owner's name attached. They spent an hour leaning against the rail, looking at the men below with some awkwardness that neither could quite turn into speech. Ortiz finally pushed the photograph back into his pocket. "If they don't find him," Ortiz started, then swallowed. The sentence folded again. "Then we'll remember what we can," Brackett said. It felt small. It felt necessary. It was, in its way, an affirmation of responsibility that had nothing to do with contracts or orders, an agreement between two people to hold the human shape of what the plant made. Word moved through the factory in waves like weather. There was a report of a successful attack that used a quieter engine in one theater. A telegram of thanks arrived to the plant from an admiralty office somewhere short-handed on adjectives. A different envelope, stamped confidential, came with a request to expedite a new batch for experimental mounts. On the same day, a corroded ledger surfaced from the supply room, an older inventory that suggested a failure mode they had partially anticipated but not fully resolved. The coexistence of praise and problem felt like the double exposure of a photograph, both images present, neither negating the other. At a meeting in the foreman's cramped office, the men gathered: foreman,
Project engineer Davies, a stern-faced logistics officer with an unlit cigar in his teeth, Brackett, and Ortiz. The walls smelled faintly of oil and old paper. The foreman read aloud the Admiralty formality, his voice flat. "We can't ignore the commendation," he said. "It'll smooth allotments. It keeps the lines moving." He tapped a pencil against his knee. "But we can't ignore the failures either." Davies, younger and more impatient, rubbed his hands. "The failures are within tolerance," he said. "We can tweak. We can adjust the reed mounts. If we change the pitch of the valve train a fraction, it'll shift noise signature. We've done the calcs." "Calcs are useful," the logistics man said, "but field reports trump calcs. If the boys at sea say they heard hums where they shouldn't." He shrugged as if the rest might be filled in by gravity. Brackett watched the room like a man watching a small animal pacing the bottom of a cage. "We test," he said finally. "We test differently. Take composites of failures and successes and run them until the failure," he searched for the word that would not turn his meaning into artifice, "until the failure is not possible, or at least less likely." Davies' answer was mechanical. "We don't have time. The theater needs." "Theater will be there after," Brackett cut in. "Our duty isn't just to send something out on schedule. It's to send something that won't make a bad day worse." The foreman looked at him, then at the logistics man, then at Davies. Time and money pulled at them like tides. The work had to be done. The plant's existence depended on the ability to deliver on orders.
The moral ledger. Brackett's private book he kept in a drawer beneath his bench took on a new entry. Not numbers or tolerance curves this time, but names. He wrote them in the margins with a pencil stub and smudged the lead with a fingertip as if the act of smearing might alter the weight of the word. He thought of the long arc of things they made, tools that had been used for industry, for rescue, for crime, for war. He marveled at the slipperiness of intent. The same torque that opened a valve could also close a throat. Beyond the immediate grief, a different pressure began to settle. The Admiralty wanted more engines, sooner, with assurances. The company that owned the plant wanted production up. Men at the bench wanted steady pay. Brackett found himself walking a ridge between competing urgencies: the human need for livelihood, the strategic demands of a nation at war, and the ethical insistences of conscience. He had no formula that reconciled them. He had only a steadying collection of small acts: refusing shortcuts, insisting on extra testing where needed, calling attention to tolerances others might dismiss. Conversations softened into other forms. Men who had been content with the mechanical miracle of deliverables began to ask questions in quiet places. They spoke about faces, about letters, about the weight of a name you could no longer call at night. The plant's logbooks became readable as more than technical manuals. The marginalia, a shorthand note here, a puzzled question there, accrued a human punctuation. It was a record not only of what they had done, but of how they thought about what they had done. There were moments of public celebration that felt incongruous. Speeches at a local hall, a luncheon for union representatives and company chiefs, a ribbon cut for a new dock that would facilitate deliveries. Men wore jackets for an afternoon even though they returned to the shop with grease on the cuffs. They smiled at cameras pointed from a distance that could only capture the surface. Brackett attended one such gathering and felt like a man who had been summoned to read the epitaph of something he had helped build, but whose names he could not reconcile. At night he dreamed in metallic fragments, bearings that refused to seat, valves that sang like sirens, faces dissolving into oil. He woke with the taste of iron in his mouth and sat at the kitchen table until dawn loosened fear into the clearer, colder shape of resolve. He began to write letters to men at sea whose names had been mentioned in passing reports. He wrote short, honest notes about what they had done in the plant, what they had learned about flaws, about improvements. He described the drills, the tests, the extra day of inspection he had insisted upon.
He did not pretend to absolve outcomes. He offered his care and his willingness to answer questions.
Some replies were cold or absent. One came back with simple thanks and a short, laconic question about a specific batch number. Another came from someone whose brother had walked into the sea and not returned. The man's hand crushed Brackett's note into a paper rag of emotion and then set it down as if he had nothing left to say. Ortiz, meanwhile, began to move in the plant with a different economy. He touched parts as if they might remember the hand that had made them. Sometimes he pressed his palm against a finished casing and whispered the name of his brother like a prayer you were not sure anyone would hear. Co-workers nodded without commentary. None of them could change the ledger, but there was a solidarity in keeping the names alive. Not all choices were made in the test room. The factory's board meetings were places where ethics became bricks in a wall of budgets. A representative from the Manufacturing Oversight Committee came to inspect. He asked for metrics, for cost-benefit calculations, for angle of attack simulations. He did not want sentiment. "We make tools," he said plainly, "and tools are neutral. Their use depends on those who wield them." His words were meant to comfort or to clear responsibility with the surgical precision of accounting. They landed on Brackett like a dusting of ash. "Tools are not neutral," Brackett said, because the truth of it had settled like sediment and would not cleanse itself. The oversight man blinked. Ortiz stood behind Brackett and made no sound. "A tool may be forged without malice," Brackett went on, "but a man uses it with intention. We have to be honest about what our instruments enable." "You ask too much of us," the oversight man replied. "We are not philosophers. We are manufacturers." "Perhaps not," Brackett said, "but we are the ones who put the pieces together. We decide what tolerances are acceptable. We decide how much testing is sufficient. Those decisions are not value-free." The conversation ended with no resolution. The oversight man took his metrics and his polite nods and left with the sense that he had done what he was paid to do: assess, recommend, move on. The plant returned to its rhythms, which were not consolation. Rhythm, Brackett thought, could lull you into thinking that process equals meaning. Process could be a cloak for avoidance. Outside of those administrative corridors, other transformations began to whisper through the valley. A group of older machinists began to re-envision the engines as peacetime implements, as components for fishing vessels, for cargo pumps, for irrigation machinery. They spoke in softened tones about a return to ordinary uses, about shifting production when the conflict ended. It was a kind of hope that could be built into blueprints, a plan for repurposing, for renewal. Brackett listened to these ideas with a careful interest.
He liked the image of straps and shafts used to lift grain instead of silence used to hide a hull's approach. While he could not yet map the route from weaponry to plow, he welcomed any thought that sought to redirect skill towards sustaining life rather than shortening it. Yet the world outside the valley did not move at the same pace as their moral recalibrations. Orders still came that demanded quiet, stealth, endurance. For every suggestion of repurposing, there was a countermand. Intelligence reports, strategic briefings, men in uniform who described the necessity of winning this war with every means at the country's disposal. These claims held persuasive power, the kind that bends good people toward grim choices. If we do not do this, they argued in various tones, others will. Our hand is forced. The calculus is simple. Fewer of our people die if we build better engines. It was not a lie, exactly. It was, however, an incomplete arithmetic. Brackett felt the weight of omissions the way a jeweler feels the absence of a facet in a stone. When the ledger's sum was tallied, whose losses would be counted and whose would be footnotes? He did not have an answer that satisfied the complexity of such things. He only had small practices, deliberate testing, transparency with those he could reach, a continuing catalog of names. Winter folded the valley in. The plant's lamps threw halos on frost. A time of slower light made the machine's breaths stand out like a choir. Production numbers rose and then steadied. Men and women learned to take shifts with a muted endurance. Families gathered in gatherings that hummed with the muted static of absence. In the evenings, the town's telephone exchange seemed to sigh and then stop, waiting for reports that might mend or further wound the community. One evening, as Brackett walked home beneath a sky freckled with stars, he passed a small museum in the next town over that had recently opened a new exhibit, Technology at War. Inside, among captions that attempted sober neutrality, lay a case with a small, retired engine on a plinth. A brass plate beneath it listed its model number and the wars in which similar machines had been used. School children pushed against the glass with polite curiosity, while an elderly man in a uniform pointed out details in a low voice to his grandson. The scene did not make Brackett angry, it made him pensive. Memory, the museum suggested, turns into objects. Objects are easier to hold than the lives they touched. He walked on, thinking about the future that people spoke of in tones that ranged from hopeful to opportunistic. Surplus auctions that would disperse engines to farmers, to millers, to small ports. Makers who would rework the designs into machines for feeding and moving goods. Men who would sell components because they needed the money. He liked that possibility and feared the alternative. Machines immortalized only as instruments of conquest.
Neither fate could be determined by one shop, one man. But perhaps the small things they did, marking failures, recording names, refusing certain shortcuts, could nudge the arc. At the bench the next morning, Ortiz turned up with his knuckles white. There had been talk of an inquiry into a specific batch. A sub had failed to dive properly during a trial and had been forced to surface in an encounter that had cost lives. The investigation wanted to trace whether the engine's noise signature had contributed to the event. The plant's leadership called for a full count and prepared a defense. The narrative of responsibility would be contested in memos and testimonies. Ortiz's question was simple and contained all of his grief. Do you think, could our work have been the reason? Brackett looked at the metal on the bench, at the slight sheen that came from repeated handling. It's possible, he said. It's also possible that many other things played their parts. A hull's seam, a seamstress's wrinkled seam, a captain's decision at a bad moment. We have to be willing to look, though. They would look. They began to run through logs and test records, to map serial numbers to shipments, to cross-reference days in the schedule that fell like dominoes. The plant moved from hand-forged intuition to systematic tracing, as if the apparatus of bureaucracy could be bent to moral ends. Brackett and Ortiz found themselves partners in a slow, forensic work that required patience and meticulousness. The effort felt like an extension of their craft, not only to make, but to know what they had made and how it had been used. One afternoon in the test room, after 2 days of tracing and sifting, they found a pattern, not decisive, but suspect. A supplier's batch of bearings had shown a higher variance in tumble than acceptable. Some of those bearings had gone into the engines shipped to the theater where the sub had trouble. The discovery did not settle anything, but it changed the arithmetic of culpability. A single chain could lead to unexpected ends. They called in the supplier. A middle-aged man with fingers scorched by heat and a mouth that smiled with a certain hearty skepticism came to the plant. He listened to the findings, his jaw tightening like a spring. We'd been short-handed, he admitted, eyes flicking to a colleague who shifted with the discomfort of confession. We had to run a shift with temporary help. We thought inspection would catch any variance. Brackett felt the old argument present itself, the collision of care with expediency. He felt it like a pressure on his chest.
Men made choices under duress all the time. No one wanted to be judged more harshly than the reality required, but no one wanted to let small neglects accumulate into catastrophe. The supplier offered to replace the bearings for the plant's next shipments and to institute a double inspection protocol. It was not an admission of guilt so much as a negotiated remedial action.
Outside, the war continued its indifferent calculus. A telegram came through the following week. A mention of a convoy saved because of a silent approach. A photograph printed in the paper of a father reunited with his son who had survived a patrol due in part to the engines they had tuned. The news offered no balm to those who mourned, but it complicated the ledger again. Brackett accepted the recognition with an inward reservation and an external professionalism. He appreciated that lives might have been spared, and at the same time, he refused to let the recognition elbow out the names of those lost. The plant story taught them that history is rarely pure. It is threaded with compromise and necessity, with ingenuity that can be bent toward saving or toward harming. It is measured not only in outputs and invoices, but in the living accounts of people who touch their machines and then touch the world. Brackett found in his late shifts that the ledger he kept in the drawer had become less a list of grievances and more a chronicle of a tangled stewardship. He did not know how to balance the totals. He only knew that he could keep adding pages, that he could insist on care, that he could try to make the instruments of his trade as unlikely as possible to cause harm. One night near the winter solstice, as snow began to freshen in the valley and the plant's lamps recoiled from the cold, Brackett and Ortiz stood in the test room once more. The engine on the bench wound down into a hum that made the air in the room seem softer. They did not speak of policy or of telegrams. They did not announce resolutions. Instead, they shared a silence full of the weight of names and the small consolation of work done to the best of their ability. "Will it ever end?" Ortiz asked finally, not looking at the engine, but at the dark line of horizon where the valley met the weather. Brackett considered. "Everything ends," he said. "Wars, machines, people. But the ways we end things, the reasons we choose along the way, they carry. They become the stories people tell." He reached out and laid his hand on the engine's casing, feeling its cooling metal like a pulse. "We can try to steer those stories by the small acts we do." Ortiz's laugh was a soft, broken thing. "Small," he echoed, "seems thin against the rest." "Thin doesn't mean worthless," Brackett said. "Thin, done often, can change how a plate is finished, how a bearing sits, how a captain decides in a storm. Sometimes that's all we get." They stayed until the test room emptied and the lamps dimmed. The plant's vastness closed around them like a chest, and then night drew its curtain. Outside, the rails held their cargo, waiting for another dawn. Inside, Brackett locked his drawer where the ledger sat and walked home through the hush of the valley. The weight of his work settled into his step like a known load. The seasons would turn again. There would be more reports, more letters, more numbers to trace. There would be proposals to retool, to repurpose, to remember, to celebrate, to mourn. The plant would keep making things, and the people who made them would keep tallying both the technical faults and the human costs. And in the quiet of the night, when the engine slept and the valley breathed out into snow, Brackett would continue to add names to the margins of his book, not as absolution, but as an insistence that craftsmanship must carry memory, and that memory must be allowed to shape the things we make.